It's the 60 podcast presented by Men's Sports. I'm joined by Damien Seibold. Seibs, how are you, mate?
I am good, Tom.
Also joined on the phone by Andrew, who is the man behind the Rugby League Eye Test. Andrew, how are you, mate?
I'm doing very well, thank you. We appreciate you having me on the podcast this week.
Not a problem at all. I just want to ask you, how did this all start for you? Because it's a fantastic website you've got. I've been a fan for a long time. How did it start for you?
It sort of started by accident. So I'm a data analyst by trade. That's my day job. So I'm always looking at numbers and visualizations and things like that. So second nature to me. And I just started doing it as a side thing to improve my fantasy rugby league. So I played Supercoach and NRL Fantasy and just tried to use some numbers to get ahead there. And it started out that I had a lot of data with me and I was doing some analysis that was not really Supercoach related or fantasy football related, and started looking at it. And then the thing that probably kicked it off the most was during the 2020 season when we started getting some comments in the media about how the six again ruling was doing so many things for the game. There were more tries and more line breaks and things like that. And so I started just looking at the data and seeing, is this actually the case? Is the game any better? What's actually changed? And so that sort of kicked me on to putting on a website. I was just posting things randomly on Twitter, but there's only a 280 character limit there, so it was difficult to put the correct context in. So I started up a website, just doing some analysis on the game, and just tried to do something different than what's available.
Andrew, mate, it's Damien. I absolutely love it. Like, to be honest, I'm a footy nerd. I'm a statistical analysis nerd. So, I coach at a lower level, and as many stats as I can get hold of, even at the local A grade level, I consume. I just love it, mate. I think it's unreal. And, the big thing for me is it puts a lot of theory behind what's happening, and it helps people understand exactly why certain things happen, where the trends come from, and it gives you a better understanding of exactly what's happening in a game of footy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the one thing I always like to point out is that I'm not saying that you can run a rugby league off a spreadsheet, or it's a purely statistical game like something like baseball, but it's also not the exact opposite. You can draw trends and do really good analysis based on statistics from the game. It's part of sort of like a strategy or a coaching outlook. That's not necessarily the whole thing. It's going to feed you insights that might be able to applicable in different areas of the game.
And just to pick up on one of the comments you had then, it's looking at trends, and that's the thing. And I don't think anyone who really knows anything about rugby league would honestly believe that there's coaches out there who just coach straight from a spreadsheet or a PowerPoint presentation, because there's a lot of rubbish that gets talked in the media about certain coaches. And I think the key thing though is you look at trends, you work out, all right, well, what's happening in a game. Now it's the coach's job to work out why is that happening, what can we do to fix it or improve it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about using every bit of knowledge that you have, every bit of information you can, and getting enough knowledge out of it. There's a analyst, a guy who used to work for the Milwaukee Bucks, and he's now head of a stats bomb in the US, and he writes for The Athletic. His name's Seth Part now, and one of the things he talks about with analytics, it's the art of being less wrong. And I think that's a really great phase, and something I tend to look at as well. Is that a lot of this analysis, it might tell you what you already know. I think you guys talked last week about South not having great. Not getting downfield a lot in their first tackle because of their back three. And, you watch the game, you can see that. But it's really great to have data that backs that up, and you're not just doing it on your thoughts or your vibes or what you're seeing on the field. You've got some numerical evidence that backs it up.
Well, we will just touch on that. Is that a major stat for you, that the fact that Souths are consistently the worst team in the league this year of where they start their first tackle? So is that a glaring issue to you?
I think given how weak their forward pack's been this year through injuries and suspensions or whatever the reason may be, that it makes it a lot more difficult for them. And we know Latrell comes in and out of games, but that's part of what makes him such a great player. But then you've got Alex Johnson on the other side, who's not necessarily going to make a lot of yards coming out of his own area. So it does put them on the back foot. I think it really comes down to the team composition and how they're playing. Some teams will use their back three a lot, like the Knights. Some teams don't, like Souths. And in previous years, it's been okay because they've been able to get downfield with their middles. But that's been a lot more of an issue for them this year. So I think in the end, it's just it depends on a bigger picture.
Do you think that they're aware of that? Like, how big of a
You'd hope
issue?
so.
Well, how big of an issue do you think that they feel that is? Because there was rumour during the week that they were going after people like Dom Young. So, and we know that over the years they've tried someone like Josh Mansouri out the back, who's a legit meter eater as far as wingers go, but obviously didn't work out. And they carry Alex Johnson, like Steve said last week, because he's a noted try scorer. Do you think that they're aware of that issue?
I'd hope they would be, because I think it's such an easy way to get started in your sets, and you can see how well teams that have the strong back three. And again, if you look at Penrith and how much they suffered against the Eels when Dylan Edwards wasn't there, it's a big part of their system as well. So I think a lot of it again comes down to coaching philosophy and strategy and how they want people to fill roles. But being able to start 5 or 6 metres downfield than they are currently would probably solve a few of their problems and not put them on the back foot. Was
there anything over the weekend that stood out to you?
The one thing that, it's not necessarily a statistical thing, but just watching the Sharks-Roosters game, the way that Cronulla it was almost like they played not to lose rather than to try and win the game when Tedesco was off the field in the sin bin. There's this play, I think, with about 22 minutes to go, and they were about 10 metres out, and the Roosters had probably 5 people on the right hand of the side of the field, and most of them were playing out of position, and then Blake Brayley took the ball short side, and you could see Nico Hines just throw his arms up in the air. Just that 10-minute period just sort of felt almost like summed up the Sharks season, that they struggled against top 8 to 8 teams, and they just were trying to win, to not lose the game rather than to try and win it.
Oh, I personally think someone like Matt Moylan would have come in handy in that 10-minute period, but that's a discussion probably for another pod. Matt, I like what you said before about it's about the bigger picture, isn't it? And use all the different stats that are available to you to work out what's the best fit for you and your team. As a coach, every coach has a different philosophy. Every team has a different style or a mode of playing. And I think of it as, I had the salary cap explained to me a number of years ago, and it stuck with me for a long time. It's all about the balance, and it's all relative. So, you might look at a team and their salary cap, and, someone might argue that a player's getting paid $200,000 more than what they probably deserve. But then it all becomes balanced out because you might have 2 or 3 rookies that are just exploding out of the ground, and between them they're on 500 less than what they're probably worth. So when you balance it all out, whether it's statistics or a salary cap, the team that gets the fit right is normally the team that's up there at the top of the table.
Yeah, I think, and it's about having players fit their roles as well. I mean, you always talk about players, who's overrated, who's underrated, who's not performing to their expectation. But sometimes that expectation is probably isn't necessarily in line with what the coach is looking for them to do.
Of course, yeah.
So I'm struggling to think of one off the top of my head. But a lot of time players are asked to do a role, and that either limits what they can do or puts them into a role where they're trying to do more than they actually can. So again, there's a lot of nuances into these things, and as you mentioned, the way teams build their lists from the salary cap has a big part of it too.
Andrew, I want to talk about the Broncos and their defence, but also Panthers. If you just look at the numbers of points conceded, Panthers have put together one of the all-time seasons. It's been really, really impressive, and they've got the Broncos covered as far as points conceded. But as far as your stats go, would you bank on the Panthers' defence or the Broncos' defence?
Well, I think you'd have to be very contrarian to go against the Panthers at this stage. They've got the runs on the board. They're by far the most dominant team, and I can't imagine anyone besting them on grand final day at the moment. But I think the Broncos' defense is possibly being overlooked a little bit, and that's not just because they held Melbourne to 0 points on the weekend. The thing that I see about Brisbane is that their goal line defense and their red zone defense is really strong. They've had a lot of play the balls inside. They've defended a lot of play the balls inside 20 this year, which is not something Penrith does, because we all know how much they dominate field position. They work the ball downfield. They don't generally give up a lot of possession close to the line, whereas the Broncos do. So if you look at the number of times the Broncos have been inside an opposition's 20-metre zone versus how many times they've defended themselves, they're actually a net of 121 play the balls behind. So they've defended 121 play the balls more inside their own 20-metre zone than they've had in attack. But yet, Penrith, they're plus 317 for the same stat. So 317 times they've had more play the balls inside 20 than they've defended. So their numbers defensively are pretty much the same, and their attacking numbers are almost identical. But yet Penrith has that field position. Brisbane doesn't. but they defended it really well.
So I had a little theory on that one. It's so in my mind and what I've observed and looked at stats as well and just the eye test. I personally think the difference there is I actually reckon Brisbane, not that they allow teams into their 20, but they're almost happy to concede metres because they know that their goal line defence is so good, their line speed is spot on, and you watch one of the things that they do, they've mastered the art of going early. So they're actually almost a step or two in front of the ref before they play the ball, but it's all about timing. So they're almost a metre behind to start with. So the illusion of, everyone's on sides there, and then they're taking off, and they're nearly a step or two of a head start before the play the balls come through. So watching Brisbane, I almost think that they're happy to concede some metres into their 20, whereas Penrith really like to get up and dominate and get physical. And whether or not there's a stat that backs that up, but that's always been my theory around why Brisbane have so many more play the balls inside their 20.
Well, there probably is, and this is probably why it'll be fascinating if they both meet in a grand final, which they probably should. The fact that if we go back to the stat about where each team starts their first tackle, so Penrith is right up there, they're number 2, but the Broncos are actually 3rd worst, and now they can carry that because they've got such a great forward pack. But Andrew, do you think because they're the 3rd worst, that will feed into the Penrith defensive mentality because they'll almost choke them in their own 40?
Yeah, I think that's the one team the team that's going to be an issue for everyone. But I think that's one issue where they'll need to be on their game. That if they do meet in the grand final, is making sure they start their sets quite far down the field. But just going back to what Damien said, I absolutely agree. I think they're happy to concede metres because they know once they get that close to the line, they can hold teams out. The defence is strong, especially in the middle. They haven't conceded a lot of tries through the middle, so that's something they can really bank on. But yeah, I think Penrith will be a challenge for them, obviously, but they will want to start the ball further downfield because I think the middles probably won't make as many metres as they would in a traditional game.
Especially against Penrith. I mean, they're so good, and we all speak about how good they are. Over the last couple of years, I've almost formed the opinion that they're a little bit like the Storm for that golden period when, at the end of the day, Cameron Smith just played in a dinner suit most weekends. They did enough to get themselves to where they wanted to be, and then all of a sudden, semi-finals hit, and it was, all systems go. For me, Penrith have really only properly ripped in a couple of times this year. They've won a lot of games. They appear so much better than everyone. They're not conceding points, but I personally think there's only a couple of times where they flick the switch. So I reckon there's a bit there, a bit more in Penrith to come.
Is there anything in that their performance on the weekend against the Warriors was better than previous weeks? Like, do you think that they've gone to another level over the past couple of weeks?
Unfortunately, I didn't see a lot of that game, so I can't comment too much on that. From what I did hear on the radio, it sounded like the Warriors probably held up defensively a little bit better than most teams would in that situation.
Yeah.
But I think Damien's point about them not putting in 100% for most of the season is probably accurate. I think when you're this good and you can roll teams quite at the drop of a hat, even when some of your best players are out. I think once they get Luai back and they can. I think they'll be in a good position for the last couple of games of the season. I think they can turn it up a little bit.
Well, I even go back to I make it pretty obvious I'm the fanatical Parramatta fan, and I go back to the grand final last year when Para was on a wave. Obviously, I thought we were half a chance, but even people who didn't go for Para and just footy lovers, they all gave Para a chance. They thought they might sneak up and get him, but then all of a sudden, come grand final day, the Penrith forward pack found another gear and absolutely smashed Para. I can see that coming again. I really do.
Yeah. I think this is one of the reasons why I sort of harp on defense as well. Is a bit is that in these sort of games, the best teams are only going to give you what they want to give you. You're not going to get the sort of opportunities you get against, say, like your Titans or the Dolphins or the Tigers. So you're playing against these teams that are remarkably good defenders, and so that's why I was bringing up that point about Brisbane. Is that you can get close to Brisbane's goal line, but you're not necessarily going to get through it. And we saw Melbourne really struggle on the weekend. I know they aimed a lot of their kicks for Xavier Coates, but still they couldn't get through the line in 80 minutes. And that's why I think teams that are really focused on sound, solid defence like Penrith and to an extent Brisbane this year, they're the teams that are going to do well. And I think that's why Parramatta really couldn't compete with them in the grand final last year.
Can I ask you about Newcastle? There was a point during the year, if Newcastle lost to the Bulldogs, and Adam O'Brien was probably lining up at Centrelink the next week. Since then, they haven't lost a game and have been absolutely phenomenal. What's changed in Newcastle?
Well, again, the thing that I point out is that their defence is excellent. So if I look at some of the metrics I look at for defence, I mean, even just on an average points per game conceded since I think about round 18, they're pretty much in line with Penrith. Their defence has been strong. And I know I've listened to your podcast the last couple of weeks. You've been talking about how well Kalen Ponga's been playing, and absolutely he's been playing the best player in the competition, so that always helps. But just their ability to withstand pressure, they didn't do it all the time on the weekend against Canberra, but they managed to do it when it mattered. So again, I think outside of those top four sides, they're the only one that I think you'd see in possibly in the prelim and the grand final. I don't know if I'd pick them over the Warriors in New Zealand this weekend, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were managed to get up.
That's a tough one for him, isn't it? Heading over to New Zealand, we think Sean Johnson's going to play. There's going to be that much emotion, that much support over there. If Newcastle can find a way to win that game, I think they can make a grand final, but I don't know if they win this week.
But the problem for Newcastle, I think I will tip the Knights this week against the Warriors, but they will have had a 90-minute game against the Raiders, highly emotional at home. They would have flown to New Zealand, beat the Warriors, and then have to fly to Brisbane. So to make a grand final, it's going to be tough.
Oh, and that's what I mean. That's why this game is so tough for them. And I honestly believe if they can get through this one, they could make a GF. Because, how can you rule them out after the run they've been on?
Yeah.
But, stats, it's so interesting. We spoke about how they can be misleading, or you can basically twist a stat to suit any argument you want, really. And you mentioned it, Andrew, since round 18, the Knights have had pretty much the same defensive record as Newcastle. As Penrith. But what about the 18 weeks before that? There's always different ways you can twist and look at stats, and that's why they're so interesting, and that's why they're so thought-provoking. Because I do think that the media drives a lot of agendas in regards to what we think is happening and what the perception for the public is. The media would have you believe that Campbell Graham was the best defensive centre in the history of the game. I remember looking at Origin period, and myself and Tom, we had a little chat about it, and we brought up the stat that at that point in time, Bradman Best was statistically the best centre in the comp defensively, and Campbell Graham was actually one of the worst in regards to missed tackles. So the public get things, misconstrued by the media. Then you have some stats that you can go and have a look at. And that's why I really think that stats are a great thing. And what you're doing with that website, mate, it's for footy lovers, it's unbelievable.
Well, just on that, Andrew, do you sometimes look at the public perception and go, you're way off here?
Yeah, not necessarily in like a combative way, but it's more like an informational way. It's like, I'll see something. And again, the set restarts in 6 again era was one that was constantly coming up. You'd be hearing people coming out and saying how, the set restarts have sped up the game and it's done this and done that. And in the first season, all it was doing was basically every time there's a set restart, teams were just running the structure again and you were getting an extra 3 or 4 hit-ups. So, yeah, it's sort of like there's some narratives that come through that, it's nice. It's sort of like, I don't want to sound like myth-busting some of them, but it's sort of like, that sort of sparks my curiosity in my brain and I start thinking, is there a way you can prove or disprove this? I mean, I think the defensive one's a really tricky one because in rugby league, there's not a lot of defensive stats, and things like tackles don't necessarily correlate with win. Like making a lot of tackles doesn't correlate with winning a game. If you're making tackles, you either don't have the ball or the opposition's running at you a lot, and so there's probably a reason that's the case. So,
well, there's no
trying to find a way to quantify defense is really difficult.
There's no wrong decision stat, is there? Like, there's no, Campbell Graham's made 4 wrong decisions this game. Like,
so for a while, and I don't see it as much anymore, but for a couple of seasons, we would see there was a try-cause stat.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a great one.
The providers have try-cause and line break causes, which is one of the things I do include in some of my stats. So you can see that, but ultimately that comes down to whoever's watching the game.
Yeah, and what their opinion is.
This person let this try in when it might actually be because someone was in the wrong position, three positions in, and so they had to cover for them. So in the end, it's probably more not necessarily a true representation of what the exact cause was, but it's probably the best we're going to get in such a complex
so true.
game.
It's so true. So often, when tries are conceded on an edge, people are really quick to blame the edge, and sometimes it is the edge's issue. But the majority of the time that there's a try scored on an edge, it's because the middle is so weak, so loose. They're not working hard enough. They're not getting that line speed and that inside pressure on the halves. So it's giving them the opportunity to execute on that edge. So again, it's Who's making that call?
Absolutely correct. And Andrew, you've got a couple of stats on your website that I just want to talk about. One is the expected points for games, and the other one is the player contribution rate. First of all, the expected points for games. Can you tell me how you come up with this?
It sort of just came from, like, I watch a lot of other sports, mostly basketball, but I watch a little bit of football, NFL, those sort of things. And the one that sort of came to my mind was watching some Premier League games. You knew there was talk about expected goals. And that just sort of, I was just looking at that and thinking, I wonder if there's a way you could apply that to rugby league. And in doing some of the numbers I was doing on a set restart, so I realised I had data to sort of say, okay, this is where each play the ball is. And you can sort of look and see, okay, after this play the ball, what happened? Was it another tackle or was it a try? So I looked at that and thought, yeah, that's interesting. And the other thing that played into it was looking at basketball. They have you get points per shot or shot probability and things like that. And so I was thinking, a shot in basketball is sort of roughly equivalent to a play the ball in rugby league. You get a chance to try and score a try. So I looked at what the probability was on each tackle from locations on the field. I had to sort of draw it up and do a 4x4 grid to get enough instances of play the balls to make it significant. And just seeing what the probability was of scoring a try on a particular tackle from a particular point in field, to try and give possession a value. Because we always talk about how much possession a team has or how many tackles inside 20 they had, but what's that actually worth? And is it better to be on one side of the field or the other, or a bit closer to the posts, that sort of thing. So it was sort of, just again trying to find a way to quantify something that's always sort of talked about in a bit of a more abstract fashion.
I love looking at it post game because there was a game earlier on in the year. You might remember it. It was Manly taking on West Tigers, and I remember it was in the pouring rain, and Manly, I think they scored a couple of late tries to win it in the end, and the score was something like 18-16, 20-16, something like that. But then you posted your expected points, and it had the West Tigers winning something like 30-12. So in real life, Manly's actually done a great job to get away with that game, and the Tigers are rubbish. But everyone was saying, Manly's terrible, they almost lost to the Tigers. But if you look at the stats of what happened in the game, they actually should have lost by a large margin.
Yeah, and that's another reason I sort of was doing it as well, because it gives you a bit of an idea of how the flow of the game went, and you can see where teams had to sustain a lot of defence, or when they've had a lot of the ball in the attack. And as you said, the Tigers have been absolutely atrocious this year inside 20. Execution was horrible. But looking at those numbers, you can see, Manly didn't have a lot of ball at the end in that game, but still managed to put a few tries on the board. And so it's a good way to judge it against their actual on-field performance. It's still only an expected total. What an average team would score given the same field position and possession. But looking at how a team performs against that expected outcome is where the real insight comes from.
Yeah, it gives you a good idea of where a team is sitting or how they're travelling. Andrew, I've got a two-part question for you. The first part is, do you like to have a bet? And the second part is, has the stats given you an upper hand when having a punt?
So this will probably disappoint you, but no, I don't like to have a bet. And therefore it has not given me an upper hand.
Do you have any degenerate mates that like a bet that you've helped with stats?
I have degenerate mates, and I constantly have degenerate gamblers sliding into my DMs, asking me all sorts of questions. Interestingly, most of them tend to be about referees and things like that. But no, so I don't punt. But I've heard from a few people who've mentioned that they've used the stuff on my site to help them out, and I'm happy for them to do that. But I don't unfortunately punt myself at the moment. I know a lot of people have said that I'm probably throwing away a lot of good information that I could use for that. But it's not something I
tick a few of those boxes.
Yeah, Sieves might be in there a little bit later. And the player contribution rate, this is not a rating of how good a player is it?
It's not. You could use it as a proxy of how good a player is, but it also depends. It ties back to people's roles as well. So traditionally, players who've got the ball in their hands a lot will generally generate a lot of the statistics, and wingers and centres, as we talked about before, generally suffer from poor defensive decisions inside, and so try to score on the edges, so they generally look a little bit worse. So you could say you could use it for that, but I think for me it's more about judging what the player brings to their team and how they can, and their sort of value to them.
So do you know who had the best player contribution rating for the year and who had the worst?
Yeah, so the best player was Sean Johnson, which was actually, it was very close coming into the last round. I think Nico Hines had a chance to run him down, but didn't. So yeah, he was by far just slightly the best for the season. And the worst this season, I think, was Matt Finai from the Dragons, who somehow managed to play 24 games. The Dragons, and I've had so many Dragons fans saying they couldn't understand it. You watch any Dragons game this year, and you could see Paul Billy Burns playing on his edge as well. Yeah. Every time teams ran down that wide, I think it might have possibly been a Manly game where they ran a bunch of tries down that wing.
Well, it probably says a lot about where Dragons were at and why they were where they were, because it's clearly a depth issue, and fans are quick to jump on coaches and teams and, why is this bloke playing and why isn't someone else getting a crack? Well, reality is sometimes the person that we don't think is that good is the best option that a club has. So, it's an interesting one, and I think that I'd love to have a look at your top 5 with your player performance and marry it up to the Daily M top 5 when that's announced in a couple of weeks.
Well, who is your top 5? Do you know?
Top 5 players by my contribution rating?
Yes.
Yeah, so top 5, Sean Johnson, Nicholas Hines, Nathan Cleary, Callum Ponga, and Reece Walsh.
That's going to be pretty close.
Look, Reece Walsh will be the only one not there because he can't be up there with the suspension.
Yeah, exactly.
But the other 4, if they're not in the top 5, I'll be shocked.
So it's probably weighted to spine players as far as the contribution rate, just because they touch the ball more, yes?
Yeah, so it's also the way it's calculated. So the statistics that correlate best with winning games or also losing games, so your negative stats, those tend to be, the highest correlation is with things like tries and line breaks. So obviously they're going to come from your spine players, and then conversely, tries and line breaks conceded come from your edge players like centers and wings. Just on that as well, I think if I look from round 13 onwards, Kalen Ponga would be like a runaway winner. But because he didn't play too much and didn't really contribute too much in the first sort of half of the season, that's sort of dragged his average down a little bit, so that's why he's only 4th. But I think he'd be pretty close to top, or if not top, for the second half of the season.
I think most people would agree that it's probably going to come down to a photo finish between him and Sean Johnson to win the Dally M as well.
Yeah, Callan's going to get a lot of threes.
That run he went on late.
Yeah,
I think especially given that you've got 6 votes coming from 2 different judges this year, he's going to probably get a lot of 6s for those games too.
I agree. And Sean Johnson, again, you think about, Adam Fanua-Blake, he probably steals a few points off him when they win and win well.
But other than that...
Yeah, other than that, I think he's getting most of the votes. Wade Egan had 1 or 2 games, he might have stole some points.
Just back to the stat on the expected points, was there a game this year that you can remember that was just wildly apart? Like, is there a crazy difference in a game that ended up being on your expected points, but in real life it was just way different? Do you remember one?
It would be almost any Tigers game from the first half of the season. I seem to remember there was a run of 3 or 4 games where there'd be unexpected points meant to be winning sort of 20, 24 to 16, 24, 14 against teams where they were losing 48, 10, that sort of thing. There were a lot of, big games where they surrendered huge margins, but were well ahead on expected points because they were letting teams score from 30, 40 metres out, and they were getting a lot of ball inside 20, inside 10, and they couldn't do anything with it.
Yeah.
So
in their
those are the sort of teams that don't perform well.
Yeah.
Is there anything that indicates, like Siebes and I did our teams that we thought have the best chance of making the 8 next year, right? Is there anything that you've looked at that gives you a lot of hope for a team heading into next year? Of course, South had this epic collapse, but judging by some of the stats that I've read from you, I don't have a heap of faith that the buys that South have made are going to turn this club around rapidly. Is there a team, though, that you're looking at that has a good chance of making the 8 next year based on what they've done this year?
I think the one that would be most interesting for me would be the Titans, and it's just purely because they were so dominant in that first half of games this year, and then in the second half, whether it was discipline or defensively just switching off or whatever it was, they would collapse. And I think having someone like Hasler in might give them a sort of might bring them in line, and if they can pick their defence up, they could possibly move into that top 8. I mean, the thing that the reason why I think of that is that last year we look at the Warriors and you think Andrew Webster's coming along. He's rookie coach. We're not going to see too much improvement from them, but the job he's done defensively with them and getting them all to buy in without a lot of big name signings, especially defensively, I think that's where I think a similar thing you could see that from the Titans next year because they've got with the ball they're excellent, but defensively they just switch off too often.
I agree. I also look at that though and think the eye test tells me that Sean Johnson was injured last year. He wasn't at his best. He's a world-class halfback at his best. Warriors had someone to steer the ship. I don't think that the Titans have a half to steer the ship. They've got 4 in there, but he is a traditional tough 5'8" who's run first, not necessarily an organiser. So that will be the only interesting thing, because they've got the forward pack, they've got the strike. As you said, the first half of games, they were really, troubling everyone, not just the weak side. They were giving everyone a fright, and they even beat a few good sides during the year. It's just, for me, the reason why I'm hesitant with the Titans would be I don't know if they've got someone to steer that ship around. Because you look what Adam Reynolds did to the influence he had on Brizzy. Like, the forward pack was there, the outside backs were there, just needed someone to unlock them, and Reynolds was the man.
Yeah, agreed. I think that'll be the one area that they don't have a ready-made solution for. But I think, my thought is if they can do this well without a halfback at the moment, if Spurs can shore up some of their defensive issues, they should possibly be a bit closer to the top 8 than they've been.
The other one too, just touching on Tom's last question. Every year there's always someone that is from outside the 8 that jumps into the 8. Normally you have a look at it and it's that team that happened to lose 3 or 4 games by a try or less. They find a way to turn 1 or 2 of those games around, and they go from being 11th to 6th or 7th. Do you have a stat around winning by a small margin, and do you have anyone in that book where you think, yep, they can turn 1 or 2 of those close losses around, they could jump in?
I can't think of one off the top of my head this year. When you're talking about the small losses by small margins, that actually makes me think more of the Raiders this year, who were sort of winning by small margins.
Yeah,
I think there's a little bit of luck that goes into that.
Definitely.
So you can sort of look at that field position through expected points and see, whether or not teams are getting themselves in position to score, and then what the result of it is. But there's not something specifically that has just sort of called that out.
It's funny you say the Raiders, because they're the one that sprung to mind for me, and I think of the Raiders 2018 season where I think they lost 6 or 7 games by 4 points or less.
Yep.
They turned half of those around, and they went from missing the 8 to being top 4 and making a GF the next year. So they're a funny side. They're always either losing games they should win, or winning games you've got no idea how they got there. So they're an interesting one.
Yeah, they're a team that I've been sort of covering, looking at quite often, because they generally, like the Titans, have a lot of stats. A lot of their stats fall off in the second half, so it's always interesting to see why that happens.
Andrew, it's been such a pleasure to have you on today. We really appreciate your time. Like I said earlier, we're massive fans of what you do. For anyone who hasn't seen your website, where can they see it?
No, thanks for bringing me on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I just want to say that the best compliment that I can ever get is one you gave me the other day when on the podcast you mentioned that the guys from the Rugby League Eye Test website, so implying that there's more than just myself doing it in the very limited spare time that I have between work and family. So I do appreciate that. For anyone who's not seen the website, it's just www.rugbyleagueeyetest.com. If you search in Google for Rugby League Eye Test, it should come up pretty easily as well. Also on Twitter and most of the other social platforms at League Eye Test. So yeah, please follow, share, anything. I'm always happy to hear comments and feedback. And it's great to hear from people like yourselves who really appreciate what I'm doing and are able to apply it to what they've seen on the field.
We'd love to have you on again sometime. Thanks so much for your time.